Welcome, friends, to this presentation of Kids on the Street, Queer Kinship and Religion in San Francisco's Tenderloin, with author Joseph Plaster and moderator Jim Mitulski. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a rich treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ+ persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, we are pleased to present an in-depth discussion of Joseph Plaster's newly published book, Kids on the Street, Queer Kinship and Religion in San Francisco's Tenderloin, from Duke University Press. In this work, Plaster explores the informal support networks that enabled abandoned and runaway queer youth to survive in Tenderloin districts across the United States, beginning in the 1960s. Plaster draws on archival, ethnographic, oral history, and public humanities research to outline the queer kinship networks, the religious practices, performative storytelling, and migratory patterns that allowed these kids to foster social support and mutual aid. Plaster excavates a history of queer life that has been overshadowed by most major narratives of gay progress and pride. Joseph Plaster, PhD, is curator in public humanities and the director of the Winston Tabb Special Collections Research Center at Johns Hopkins University. His research and teaching combine archival, oral history, and public humanities methods to examine the world-making practices of marginalized publics in the United States, with a focus on intersections of gender, sexuality, and race. Reverend Dr. Jim Mitulski is a pastor, activist, and community organizer. He has pastored churches in the United Church of Christ and the Metropolitan Community Churches. He served as the denominational director of development and clergy vocations for the MCC churches and has taught courses at the Pacific School of Religion and at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. He is currently pastor of the Congregational Church of Belmont in California. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during a Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. And if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar has concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asati, who is the tech manager for this program. And now I am pleased to welcome Joseph Plaster and Jim Mitulski to this discussion of Kids on the Street, Queer Kinship and Religion in San Francisco's Tenderloin.
Good afternoon. It's great to see you, Joseph.
Great to see you too. Thanks so much for having me here.
You bet. And just as an added piece, I want to share with our viewers that not only is San Francisco the subject of your research, although there are other cities also addressed in your book, and we may talk about that if we have time, New York especially, but you're in San Francisco right now for the summer. And
yeah, I'm in here for this summer, currently in the Mission District, working on a few research projects that maybe we'll talk about later in the chat.
Well, I was delighted to be able to hear you speak earlier this year at the Tenderloin Museum, which is a great resource for people living in San Francisco, in the very neighborhood where much of your research took place. And though I'm working in a suburb now in Belmont, it was great to be back in the city at the site of where all this took place and where it's still taking place. Because it strikes me that what you wrote about, though you document a long period of history, really a couple of generations, is still unfolding. It's a continuum. It's not just something that you could periodize easily.
Yeah, a lot of these histories are very cyclical, and a lot of the issues that marginally housed youth and anti-poverty organizers were facing in the 60s or the 2010s, they're facing again now. So I do think it's relevant to what's happening in the contemporary moment.
Well, why don't you give us a little overview of what your book covers?
Okay, so I have prepared probably a little too much. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Is that visible for everyone?
I see it.
Let's see if I can get it to work. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to give just a really brief, hopefully very brief overview of what the book covers, some of the main points I make in the book. And, in the Q&A, maybe we can talk about the kind of longer journey of writing the book, which was a long process. It was more than 5 years of engaged public humanities research in the Tenderloin, during which time I conducted more than 70 oral histories, another few years of archival research, both in San Francisco, but also in archives around the country. And then, the lengthy and involved process of writing it all up as a book. But let me give you a brief overview, starting with some context. So Tenderloin is a kind of generic name for downtown vice districts around the country. They were these lodging house district where marginally housed youth regularly lived beginning in the late 1800s. And these were kind of paradoxical spaces, at once zones of abandonment, but also havens for a lot of marginalized populations, including queer populations. So this book that I've written focuses on San Francisco's Tenderloin district, primarily from the 1950s to the 2010s. And here you can see some photos of San Francisco's Tenderloin and the kind of mid-market street area around 1962. You'll see all the peep shows, the sailors, the bikers, the kind of SRO hotels that would have marked districts like these. And so kids on the street is a phrase I use in the book. And this is a phrase that street kids themselves circulated as early as the 1920s and maybe earlier. So kids were usually teenagers through their early 20s, but that term doesn't necessarily refer to chronological age. A kid could really be of any age. The phrase instead refers to a person's role in the Tenderloin's intergenerational sexual economies and kinship networks. So the kids are people who perform youth to stimulate desire and potential clients, and those who are cared for, often materially and emotionally, by queer mothers, fathers, aunts, and uncles. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out what the book was about. And it's about a lot of things, but the primary argument that I'm going to focus on today is twofold. Number one, that abandoned and throwaway youth in Tenderloin districts created a politics of reciprocity and mutual aid as early as the 1920s and well through the present day. So what does that mean? Basically means if you watch my back, I will watch yours. If you take care of me, I'll take care of you. So kids developed all of these conventions for collective housing, self-policing mechanisms, and networks for pooling resources. And they did this not because they were necessarily heroic or altruistic, although sometimes they were, but because it was a necessity for mutual survival. They had to care for one another in order to survive in really harsh situations. And so the second part of that argument is that kids found all of these ways to instantiate that kind of politics of reciprocity and pass it down over time through performance, which I'm defining really, really broadly in this book. So today I'm going to talk just a little bit about the use of kinship terms and the creation of street families as one kind of performance. I think what we'll focus on is street churches and the use of religious ritual to create kinship. All of these wildly creative storytelling traditions I'm including under the rubric of performance. And I may have a chance to talk about Coy Ellison, a runaway in San Francisco's Tenderloin, who passed himself off for decades as an illegal Irish immigrant. And, you know, I devote a whole half of a chapter to explaining why that was significant. And then all of these migratory circuits that connected far-flung Tenderloin districts around the country and bound bodies to seasonal and festival rhythms. So I'll move pretty quickly through this. Reciprocity, mutual aid. I mentioned they created this kind of politics before the homophile movement, before the gay liberation movement. And they pooled their funds. A queen in Seattle's Pioneer Square recalled, for example, housing up to a dozen kids at a time in the 1930s. And she recalled, it was like kids together, fellows, comrades. The gay kids looked out for each other. We had to protect ourselves. And my informant, Michael Norton, who hustled San Francisco's Tenderloin in the 60s, similarly said that it was like kids together, or I'm sorry, the kids watched out for each other. If one had a place to live, then 3 or 4 or 5 others would be living there. Each would pitch in. None of us went hungry. So street kids banded together for a number of reasons, to generate protection from physical violence and to survive in these really difficult situations. They developed forms of reciprocity through migration. So for example, Joel Roberts, who was one of the people who organized a organization called Vanguard in the Tenderloin, told me about running away from home in the 60s and finding a street family in Times Square. This queen gave him a street name, Blaze, and invited him into her SRO apartment where a dozen other kids were sleeping. The kids taught him how to hustle, pool resources, and share information about abusive police and clients. And then during the winter of 1965, Joel told me that he caught a ride from Times Square to San Francisco's Tenderloin and found many of the exact same people in that district who had traveled from Times Square. So he told me that seeing them on the street was, quote, like coming home. And this is an image from a study in 1983 that tried to map some of the migratory patterns of hustlers and street youth. So I also found that kinship, family were common frames through which street kids express this kind of politics of reciprocity. So Lala Yantes, who identified as genderqueer and hustled Polk Street in the 1990s, told me about, quote, these kids and these little families that we make up out here that just accept you for who you are and what you do. These kids looked out for each other. When one was sick, the other made sure they had what they needed. When one of them went to jail, we made sure that we kept up a room because we were always living in hotels. We just did what we had to do for each other like a family, except there were none of the hangups that came along with a bloodline. So I also found, and this is one of the surprising things for me, at least as a researcher, that religion and Christianity in particular were also common frames through which street kids fostered mutual aid and thought about reciprocity. So in the book, I write about all of these queer underground churches that serve street kids in Tenderloin districts from the 40s to the 2010s. These queer ministers I follow often denounce the respectable world, including the respectable gay world, as immoral, and elevated the outsider and the outcast to the realm of the sacred. They oversaw rituals, including ordinations, faith healing ceremonies, communions, etc., that united abandoned people as brothers and sisters in Christ, right? So you can see how street families, street churches, they're kind of like interlocking systems that enabled people to create community. So I write a lot about a lot of figures in the book, but one example that I'll briefly talk about is the Reverend Raymond Broshears and his work with the street youth activist group called Vanguard in the 60s. And I go into great deal in the book, so I'll just give you a very quick overview. Broshears was a Church of God minister in the South in the 50s and early 60s. He was arrested in 1964 at 29 years old on charges of sexual relations with another man. He actually served some time in jail, and he recalled that his family and extended family disowned him. So in 65, he fled to San Francisco and took up residence in one of the SRO hotels in the Tenderloin, the kind of mid-Market Street area. And it was only there he later wrote, quote, that I would even admit that I was homosexual. But Broshears drew on scripture to reinvent himself as a kind of righteous crusader for street kids in the Tenderloin. A lot of kids who were tarnished as criminal, immoral, lowly, sinful. So this piece of scripture I think is really fascinating. And I found that a lot of the street ministers quoted this. Sometimes we wonder why God in his infinite mercy reached down and saved us, for we are so unworthy. The Bible says God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the things that are mighty. So the more unworthy we feel, the more he can use us. The more lowly we are, the greater winners we are for God. So, in his mind and in a lot of people's mind, it's hard to be more lowly than a survival sex worker in a downtown Tenderloin Vice District. But, Broshears, by drawing on scripture, kind of flipped that around and made the argument that he and other street kids were actually some of the most holy people, and built his congregation around it. So he ordained himself through the Universal Life Church. He founded his own Church of God. And he also organized a seminary through which he trained and ordained ministers. And a lot of them were street kids. And many of them were activists, young activists in the street organization Vanguard. So this is where his story intersects with Vanguard. And I conducted oral histories with 3 former organizers of Vanguard, who also told me that Christianity at a young age offered them resources for managing and reinterpreting some of the abuse they experienced at home. So Joel Roberts, who I mentioned earlier, told me, I don't have happy memories of my family, but while I was living it, I made it happy. I think that's part of why religion attracts me, because, quote, you get all of these religious stories of people turning something good out of something really bad. Catholicism was a story about a man who was persecuted, beaten, and crucified, and somehow ended up being the winner. So a kind of similar moral story to Broshears' story. I found that in early 67, after meeting Broshears at a Vanguard meeting, a young person named Adrian Raveru and his boyfriend, a 19-year-old Vanguard organizer, joined his seminary and was ordained as part of that seminary. So here is Adrian, the Vanguard organizer, in a clerical collar after being ordained into Broshears' church. And Adrian told me that he and Broshears walked the streets of the Tenderloin at night and provided the kids referrals to social service organizations. This is what he told me in an oral history. Brashears carried a wallet that was extremely thick with references. You need a place to stay, he'll look through his wallet, find a place, and get a home for a person for the night. You don't have any money, he'll reach into his wallet. If somebody didn't have any food, he would then look through his big notebook in his pocket and find different numbers. So in addition to that, Vanguard organizer, former Vanguard organizer Keith St. Clair told me that he enrolled in Brashears seminary in '67. And here's, you can see his application for ministry in Brashears Church, which is one of the archival documents I found at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, which is an incredible archive. So, you know, all of these young activist ministers oversaw marriages, they engaged in faith healing rituals, and they found emergency housing for the kids on the street. And I'll just briefly end by giving you the overview of the argument I make about the place of religion in these Tenderloin districts among queer people. It's that these kind of street churches, is what I'm calling them, were and remain. There are still people that are doing this work in the Tenderloin, essential sources of housing, food, and other material resources for abandoned youth in the central city. As such, they're part of the accumulation of obligations and reciprocities that comprise the street scene. But street churches also offered a powerful critique of the moral order that cast street kids as unclean, damaged, and deserving of abandonment. Drawing on scripture and ritual, queer ministers established the superiority of the poor and the lowly over the wealthy and powerful. And many, like Brashears and Vanguard, drew on these religious commitments to fuel their path-breaking activism. And so I'll stop there, and I'll just look forward to the conversation that we're going to have.
Thanks so much for that really thorough overview. And let me just tell people who might be interested in reading this book, read the book. That's only one strand. It's a dominant strand in the book. I mean, you really emphasize that, but there are many jumping off points that you really do justice to. And I want to appreciate about this that you bring to a writing about LGBT history an awareness of class. Your class analysis is really significant, and that sometimes honestly is lacking in our community. And it was refreshing to see, but it also helped you see something that even, you know, middle class LGBT people and the assimilating LGBT movement of the last 40 years would never see. This history that you've uncovered, recovered, preserved is invisible to many, even LGBT people. And if you go to the Tenderloin today, a lot of what's left of it is also invisible. I mean, you really captured something that might have been overlooked entirely. And not even discoverable, except for the hard work you've done in terms of the research. So I just wanted to appreciate that about you and your work. You are keenly aware and draw attention to and make sense of class dynamics, because this is really, I mean, it's about people who found meaning in the Bible. And like, this could be right out of the book of Acts, you know, some of these stories about communities and their attention to, the writings of Paul, especially, they see it through the lens, not only of queer, marginal, but also impoverished. And that's a connection to things like liberation theology, which has its, which in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s was talking about the preferential option for the poor as the lens through which to read the Bible. So you really help connect it in so many ways to other communities too. And just, like I said, I wanted to appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And maybe just briefly, I'll say that it took me a while to realize that when my informants, the people I was talking with in the Tenderloin, said kids or kids on the street, they didn't necessarily mean LGBTQ homeless youth. What it really means is identification with being outcast, with being other, with being marginalized. And oftentimes that included people who identified as queer, but it didn't necessarily have to. So it was this kind of coalitional politics, I think, that you're talking about, that in many ways they were united by their experiences of social but also economic abandonment. So that's where the class issue comes in.
And the kinds of religion that they explicitly engage are also religious groups that are more characteristic of working class or that end of the spectrum. So Pentecostalism, evangelicalism, these less regulated, more independent kinds of movements, in a sense, could accommodate who they were and what they were trying to do in a way that more mainline churches could not. Now, I'm hoping you'll talk at some point about what the mainline, I hate that expression, but churches like the United Methodist Church or the Episcopal Church, how they were present also in the community through things like Glide. But brochures, for example, didn't wait for them. He innovated because he was a part of this sort of unregulated, like Pentecostalism, not respectable, not even well educated necessarily in the conventional theological sense. When you talk about seminary, you're not talking about the seminary in Berkeley that has been there for 150 years with theologians and degreed scholars. But they did do something teaching people about religion and who they were, that equipped them not only to be participants but leaders. That really struck me too in the kinds of thing that you uncovered. These organizers like brochures and others were not just about creating disciples; they were about creating leaders to do work.
Right. Yeah. And I'll just briefly mention, I see among the attendees a kind of celebrity in my eyes, Ed Hansen. So he was the first youth minister at Glide to work with Vanguard. So, I mentioned Vanguard being associated with brochures and with his kind of anti-establishment, anti-respectability street churches, but Vanguard was also at the same time housed by Glide Methodist and financially enabled by them. And Ed Hansen, it's so great to see him here, was one of the key organizers that helped bring that group into being. So, there was often, I think, tension between, for lack of a better word, the mainline churches and these anti-respectability politics street churches. But there were many times too where they worked in unison, and street kids, marginally housed youth, benefited from both of their styles of organizing and ministry.
Well, I'm so glad that Ed is here, by the way. I knew him in Los Angeles at Hollywood United Methodist Church, where he did a wonderful kind of ministry, especially to people with AIDS, that in a generation later. So talk a little bit about this. I mean, we've got the people who are doing these like weird blend, by weird, I mean esoteric blend of evangelicalism and Catholic liturgy. But then you've got Glide Memorial Church, which is still here, still doing the work, endowed so that its ministers would be free to do this kind of work and not have to answer to congregations in a sense. And talk a little bit about what places like Glide, how do they work? They were aware of each other. They did work together through people. Were both necessary in a sense to achieve what was being done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess if we're thinking about the example of Vanguard, of this very early gay liberation organization, active 1966, 1967, they were up against quite a lot. It took them quite a lot of effort to create this organization that nobody really thought could ever exist. So they needed all of the help that they could use. And that included not only Glide Methodist, who, as I mentioned, provided offices, provided financial resources. It included not only, Raymond Broshears and other street ministers who did things like ordain them into their church, which I'm not sure would be something that Glide Methodist would be able or willing to do. And also injected a kind of oppositional queer politics into that theology in a way that Glide was not necessarily doing. But then, Vanguard was also relying on organizations like the Society for Individual Rights, the Mattachine Society, all of the homophile organizations. So yeah, I think oftentimes when you look at the historical record and writings about not only Vanguard, but other kind of revolutionary organizations, they focus on the one particular leader, like a charismatic leader, or they focus on a small group of people. But in reality, these movements required the participation of a huge number of people and a huge number of people working at different social strata and with different kind of tools. So yeah, I think probably they did need all of the above.
And Vanguard had a life not only once, but in a sense came back, or had a renaissance, if you will. And I want to also at this point comment that you are part of this research. You don't simply dispassionately chronicle. You're present in the narrative, and in a sense, not in an intrusive way in any way, but because you always acknowledge your presence and what it means. But when you came to San Francisco, did you know that you would become part of what it is you were studying? That you would become involved, say, in the 90s in some of this?
No. I mean, so I graduated from a small liberal arts college in 2001, and I came to San Francisco just to be queer. That's it.
Okay.
And that meant a lot of things. Like, I mean, when I started the project, I guess I was just kind of walking around the city as a young person trying to figure out what it meant to be queer, and I would walk around the Castro district, which didn't really call to me for whatever reason. I would walk around the kind of south of Market and go to some of the leather clubs, and that was very interesting, but it didn't call to me. But then, I just started walking around Polk Street, like going to the clubs, dancing at Divas, which was a trans club, going to drag shows. I started volunteering with street ministers, and actually one of the other people that's in as an attendee right now is the Reverend River Sims, and I hope we can talk about his ministry as well, which is a big part of the book. And he, like Broshears, is among other things, positions himself as part of this old Catholic tradition, which is a really rich social justice tradition, and devotes itself to serving people in the margins. But anyway, that's just to say that I found that this area had a rich history and I was drawn to it. I wanted to learn more about it so that I could learn more about myself. It was also during a kind of .com boom. So there was a wide-scale gentrification of the city. There were a lot of new neighborhood and business associations that were, especially on Polk Street, closing down queer bars, policing street kids away. And, I remember feeling very emotional about it. It felt like that kind of gentrification was erasing a history that I had come to claim as my own. And I wanted to kind of document it while I still could. And then, yeah, to answer your questions about the kind of political commitments, I think like a lot of I wasn't dispassionate. I felt a kind of ethical responsibility to respond to the kind of policing and displacement of the people I was meeting and whose stories I was recording. So before writing up any of the research, I worked on these two engaged public humanities projects that I hoped were going to intervene in debates around gentrification, public safety, the kind of criminalization of the homeless in San Francisco. So I worked on a wide-scale oral history project, which is called Polk Street Lives in Transition, which I write about in the book. And then, to your question, I think this was around 2010, 2011, which is to say that this book has been a long time coming. It's I've been working on it for far too long, really. But around that time, I worked with people, including the Reverend Megan Rohr, to develop this project called Vanguard Revisited about the history of Vanguard. And we enlisted a lot of contemporary marginally housed youth in the Tenderloin in interpreting that history in relation to their own lives through historical zines and walking tours and protests around lack of housing. We reenacted this piece of 1960s street theater. So, ultimately the whole point was to stage this kind of reenactment of history in order to call for economic justice at that contemporary moment.
Can you talk about the street sweep for a moment, because it's so dramatic and so the reenactment and what it was referencing in a sense, and it's, by the way, this is the book that Joseph was just mentioning, Vanguard Revisited, but you can also get that chronicles some of this.
Yeah, well, if you hold up the book, you can see the picture of the street sweep. And so this was an action in 1966 by Vanguard. There were police sweeps of the Tenderloin district, and especially that mid-Market Street district around Powell Street that was known for street hustling. And the kids in Vanguard decided, we don't want to be swept away by the police. We are not trash. And so we are going to go and protest. And if you go and find that photo, you can see that the signs they're wearing around their necks say, all trash is before the brooms, right? And so it was this really forceful statement really about their own worth and their own value as human beings. And so when Megan Rohr and other people and I were working with young people in the 2010s, it was also this time, that the city was kind of cracking down on people experiencing homelessness, especially. And the young people we were working with were really taken with that original action and decided that they wanted to reenact it. But they were going to do it not in the Tenderloin, but in the Castro. And this is where, what you were saying at the very beginning, these kind of class cleavages in the GLBTQ community come to a fore, because many of the merchants in the Castro had supported, for example, the passage of sit lie, which was a law that made it illegal for people to sit and lie on the sidewalks. So young people reenacted that action in the Castro. They said, we have value, we are not trash, and you should look at this longer history, this longer queer history of marginalization and resistance before you support laws like this that will disproportionately impact queer and trans youth.
Well, and because of the history that you acquainted them with and that you've helped chronicle and document and preserve, that past history empowered another generation, a new generation. And I think what was so striking about it as a moral act is that it wasn't just an indictment of a broader society that might be seen as unsympathetic to a straight society, for example, that might be unsympathetic to queer youth. It was an indictment of middle-class LGBT people
Right.
as well, who had turned their backs, or we had turned our backs, collectively speaking, identifying with that group to some extent, on this. The people who assemble, who find themselves on the streets, if you will, in the Tenderloin. It has continued to be a place where the people who society sees as disposable gather and miraculously, to use a religious term, make community using these rituals and that you also compare to Christian rituals. Sometimes they're explicitly in imitation of or influenced by, and sometimes they resemble them phenomenologically. But nevertheless, religion, if you will, in the broadest sense, is both a source of oppression, but also a source of liberation. They seize it themselves and reinvent it.
Right, exactly. And the same could be said for family. I mean, for many of these kids, once they all arrived in Tenderloin districts, they reinvented the meaning of family and created kinship among themselves. You
use storytelling as a pivotal way of, as a fundamental, really, way of doing your scholarship. Is there a story that stands out, or a person that stands out, that you want to say anything about? A personal story that's illustrative of?
Yeah, well, I guess I mentioned it earlier, the story of Coy Ellison, who I spent many hours recording his story. He was a bartender at the Gangway and other bars, spent many hours just like sitting at the bar and ordering drinks from him and chatting. And I spent half a chapter talking about his story, which is, he escaped from this abusive home in the 70s. He fled to Polk Street. He was a teenager, and he began passing himself off on the street as an illegal Irish immigrant, and affected an accent, began creating a kind of background story for this character he had created. And people either believed it or wanted to believe it. But what it did for him, it's a little bit too much to get into here, but at the very least, it enabled him to find work in some of these bars and gay businesses. He was very charming. It also enabled him to create a kind of different persona with a different past, a better past. It allowed him to put the abuse behind him. But then, what I continue to find really remarkable is that it enabled him to transform himself. That kind of storytelling, telling this kind of objectively false story, enabled him to come into his own, to transform himself, to become part of this social world in the Tenderloin that was so accepting of him. So, like working with Coy really changed my approach to recording oral histories. It's not just about gathering facts. It's also understanding how narrative operates in different social worlds. And, I found that the function of a story in the Tenderloin and Tenderloin districts isn't always to describe a kind of objective reality or tell an objective truth, but it's to kind of act on reality, to kind of call forth this, social world of fantasy and belonging.
Well, you really value their stories too. You treat them like sacred story, and not all stories resolve in a positive arc. And sometimes they take a long time to reveal themselves. I appreciate that you treat them as a serious source of information and wisdom, really, in telling the story.
And another story is actually River Sims, and I'm really glad that he is here on this chat. I'm not going to try to tell his story, but he told a story about his biological son, and how their relationship played out on the streets of the Tenderloin over many decades. And I hope I've been able to represent that story in a book that in a way that River feels really good about.
You do also, there's so much in this book, but you do devote particular attention to how AIDS at the appropriate time in the chronology affects the all the things that you're talking about, and also drug use. Both those two strands, I think, are demonstrate. I mean, you tell the story, and then also you don't sugarcoat it. There's also great stories of redemption and liberation in it, but they're definitely part of it.
Yeah,
and they're overlaid, but they're separable strands too.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that I learned is that all of these kinship networks, these queer socialities, they're really fragile. They're very, very fragile. So when something devastating happens, like the twin epidemics of HIV/AIDS and the rise of methamphetamine use, that completely undermines all of the forms of kind of mutual aid and reciprocity that make the scene functional. So yeah.
I did notice, I worked in the Castro as a pastor of a gay church in the 80s and 90s. And it was in some ways a leveler. It was a connector between the Tenderloin and the Castro. When those two variables that you mentioned, both the drugs and AIDS, affected the middle class Castro, it often it did the same thing, had the same effect of undermining, and also it connected the two neighborhoods in a way.
There was some empathy, maybe.
Yeah. We do have one question in the Q&A that I'm going to read because it's the only way I can do justice to it. Okay. So William Stell provided this. Thank you so much, Joseph and Jim. I'm 3 chapters into the book and I'm loving it and have so many questions, but for now I'll ask just one. So far in the book, I've noticed that while mental illness and suicide are quite prominent in the primary sources, these two matters don't feel especially prominent in your own analysis. Could you say a bit more, whatever comes to mind? I'm not searching for anything in particular about mental illness and suicide in this history, and perhaps I'm particularly interested in your process of deciding what to say and what not to say. So I know that's a lot, but I couldn't summarize it without reading it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, in large part, this book is the kind of history of the survivors, the people who actually made it. So I think what I was most interested in was documenting all of the survival strategies, all of the ways in which people in incredibly difficult situations were still able to make meaning in their lives, were able to create connections with other people, and were able to survive. So I did make a choice to focus more on that than all of the people that did not survive. At the same time, I didn't want to insist that there was liberation when maybe there was just survival for many. So I did try to toe that line. But there were many things I did not include in the book, in part because I was trying to protect my informants, kind of trying to protect the people who shared their story with me, who are so marginalized and so pathologized on an everyday basis. I didn't want my representation of this social world to contribute in any way to their continuing to be pathologized.
Your respect and your affection, if I may use that word, for the people whose lives you are telling us about comes through. I mean, it's never judgmental or dismissive or patronizing in any way.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question here. Did the kinship networks view exiting the scene and becoming financially stable as desirable and work toward a life beyond survival? Or was the intention to remain in the existing kinship networks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was different for different people, obviously. I got the sense that a lot of people did leave the Tenderloin when they could. So, for example, the person who is on the cover of the book, and you'll see him in this beautiful, I think, a yellow dress. Oh no, yes, the yellow dress with the gorgeous peroxide hair. So he started out as a hustler on Polk Street at the age of 15, I think in the mid 70s, and was very successful. I don't think that he ever intended to remain there forever. And actually, he's a success story because one of his longtime Johns ended up leaving him in his will this gorgeous house near Ocean Beach, which is where he still lives. And so, one of the things that I'm doing this summer is going out to his beautiful place that was, gifted by this John, and continuing to record his life story. He invited me out there this March. He has this treasure chest full of photos that people have taken of him over the years, which he's donating to the GLBT Historical Society. But then while I was there, he made it clear that he trusted me and that he really wanted someone to record his longer life so that it was preserved and archived. So having said that, I mean, I would say that River Sims, who is currently an attendee in the chat, has been developing congregations and developing kinship networks with marginally housed people for decades now. And he's still doing the work. He's still in the Tenderloin. And my guess is that he will continue to do that work.
Yeah, I too want to applaud that he has been doing this work continuously for a couple of generations now. I want to ask you quickly, you mentioned a little bit about this project that you're working on currently, but what's next for you? Do you have a next big project? I mean, that's a big project, but any other projects? Has this led you to further inquiry, deeper inquiry, other inquiries?
I think the life history will be really interesting this summer. I am also recording oral histories associated with the Nob Hill Theater, and
Cool.
I'm just starting out on this project. So this was an erotic theater that was open from late 60s to I believe 2018, 2017. If anybody is interested in sharing their story about their experiences there, please reach out to me. Also in Baltimore, I've been working on, for the past nearly 5 years, a really dynamic collaboration with the ballroom scene in Baltimore. And so for those of you who don't know, I mean, ballroom is this performance-based subculture, essentially composed primarily of queer and trans people of color. It was founded in Harlem in the 70s. It's been popularized through films like Paris is Burning and Pose. So I work with them to stage annual, really glamorous ball competitions at this opulent library in Baltimore. We've recorded oral histories and archived the history of ballroom in Baltimore. We've been working on Vogue workshops, dance workshops. We're getting students involved. So it's really an effort to do a kind of community engaged archiving project and to approach performance as this kind of system for archiving as well and for passing down information.
Well, I just want to again commend the book. For people who are watching, this is essential San Francisco history. It's essential queer history. It's theology, it's spirituality, it's many disciplines are used to tell a story that you will be glad to have engaged. So I urge you to read this book and to buy this book and to share this book. And I see Mark has come back on, so he may have some concluding remarks, but you get a final word, Joseph. Anything else?
No, thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, I'm so happy to talk with you about the book.
Thank you so much, Jim and Joseph, for this probing and illuminating discussion. And thanks to all of you who listened and offered your comments and greetings and questions this evening. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, do check out the LGBTQ RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of all of our past presentations. Our next webinar on July 27th will be Designating a Religious Venue as an LGBTQ+ historical site, with historian Heather White, PhD, and Jay Stockley, who is director of the New York City LGBTQ Historical Sites Project. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. Finally, I remind you that if you would like to offer personal greetings to Joseph or to Jim, stay here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. I close again with much gratitude and appreciation to Joseph Plaster and Jim Mitulski, their insightful and provocative sharing with us. Good night to all.